Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to participate in these meetings. It's my first OASPA, and I'm enjoying very much indeed. And I especially thank Abel Parker for suggesting my name to give this conference. My presentation has as starting points two propositions. One is inspired by the statements of the French anthropologist of science Bruno Latour, for whom, quoting him, for 50 years what is called globalization has in fact consisted in two opposing phenomena that have been systematically confused. Latour points out that, on the one hand, shifting from a local to a global viewpoint ought to mean multiplying viewpoints, registering a greater number of varieties, taking into account a larger number of beings, cultures, phenomena, organisms, and people. This he calls globalization plus. On the other hand, according to him today, the term globalization is used to mean a single vision, in fact, entirely provincial, representing a very small number of interests limited to a few measuring instruments, to a few standards and protocols. For him, it has been imposed on everyone and spread everywhere. This he calls globalization minus. My second set of propositions is based on the work I and my research group have been developing on the role of open science to social change. In order to do that, we have worked on conceptual frameworks and practical experiments which point out to the central role of an ethical and biopolitical framework. It is from these propositions that I intend to bring some points of discussion and, above all, questions about the possible meanings of an inclusive globalization and about the role of science in this matter. I have structured my presentation in four argumentative axes as follows. My first point is that this debate must be situated in the context of urgency and complexity in facing the critical state of the world today, in particular the climate emergency. I proposed that emergent climate regime should correspond to a new regime of knowledge and information, science included. This brings into question the need and the viability to promote joint efforts for and dialogue on our endangered collective futures, as well as questioning the very concept of global. A new category of global issues emerges: political, economic, social, migratory, environmental, the latter threatening the very life on the planet. On the one hand, everyone is under threat and has a duty to act on it. On the other hand, the causes and impacts of this crisis are not equally distributed, which means different conditions and responsibilities to tackle it. This imposes new tasks and challenges to science. Science is called directly to action and to review its role and mode of operation. It is required not only new agendas, what to do, but above all, new ways of intervention, how to do it. The current crisis corresponds to a crisis of solutions, which demands new ways of approaching problems, other knowledge bases, and also other ways of doing science. It should also be noted that most of humanity is excluded from major scientific infrastructure, or rather it is included in an exclusionary mode. In quantitative terms, most science is produced or at least made visible in the countries that concentrate just 1/5 of the planet's population. Therefore, science and technology research agendas have been dominated by issues that do not correspond to the needs and priorities of most of those located in less developed economies. This reveals the existence of two scientific words and a new form of peripheral integration on the global stage. Science and technology are thus at the core of major contemporary geopolitical inequalities at the world level. At the same time, the current crisis of institutional representation and of representative democracy has also affected the public perception of science. It has led to movements of discredit in the methods and findings of scientific knowledge, thereby disqualifying its role and contribution to signaling, understanding, and addressing contemporary critical issues and their solutions. This includes positions such as the denial of the current climate change and its anthropogenic causes, flat earth theories, opposition to vaccination, as well as reactions to scientific advances in ethnic, racial, and gender issues, women's and mental health, drug policies, among other topics. This scenario is even more dramatic, at least for most Latin American countries, particularly Brazil today, with the drastic cutbacks and the unprecedented dismantling of the institutional infrastructure that supports public research and education. The solution to these problems requires new forms of relationship between science and society. Nevertheless, crises may also, and may not, open up new opportunities. The question is, to what extent does the pressure for alternative development styles lead science to be permeable to other values and practices, or even motivate paradigmatic shifts in science power structures? More specifically, if there is room for global thinking in this context, what does it mean and what role should it play? The ethical political question that is posed there is what counts and who counts? I will return to this point later on. My second point is that the challenge of a global science involves more than having access to or circulating contributions of scholars from different parts of the world. It also involves the recognition of other epistemologies and narratives, as well as the contributions both from the peripheries and from below. Since the end of the 1960s, criticisms were directed at the role of the dominant scientific and technological patterns, especially in the last 2 centuries, in the deterioration of the planet's environmental conditions. Questions have also been raised about the epistemic universality of established science. Many point out that Western scientific paradigms have promoted invisibility and created obstacles to the development and recognition of other and more diverse scientific trajectories and types of knowledge that could make room for more sustainable development roads. The thesis of a universal thought as equivalent to modern Western science has been contested, giving way to the idea that knowledge has a perspective character, that regimes of truth and epistemic authority are formed based on institutional rules conditioned by power relations and cultural biases. In this context, a set of counter-hegemonic views on knowledge and science has emerged, expressing, in Michel Foucault's words, a true insurrection of subjected knowledge. It originates from various lines of thought inspired by and inspiring social movements, from environmentalism to feminist and queer theories, anti-racist, post-colonial, decolonial, and subaltern studies, the ecology of knowledges, and the epistemologies of the South. Part of these lines of thought assumes that contemporary scientific knowledge must be situated within historical geopolitical asymmetries. This is the case of the post-colonial perspective and its decolonial inflection from the Latin American thought. The latter proposes the notions of coloniality of knowledge and geopolitics of knowledge, expressing how colonialism constituted a globalized system of power that reverberates in the contemporary mode of scientific production. It has also been disputed certain conceptions used to describe the global geopolitical structure, such as developing and developed countries and regions, which expresses a clear hierarchy in the global system based on the imposition of an ideal and idealized development style. The notions of global South and global North, Eastern and Western societies have also been criticized. In this respect, the Palestinian intellectual Edward Said had already argued that the East was forged by the West as an invention that kept aside as an externality the orderness of the non-Western societies. We could think from the same perspective of the North-South division. In all cases, these are categories that suffer from the same inadequacy as they homogenize very diverse and heterogeneous economic, political, and social realities into totalizing and monolithic overarching blocks. Alternative theoretical frameworks prefer non-essentialist or determinist approaches about geopolitical positions, argue that they should serve as open fields for formulating and enunciating other ways that would allow them to reconstruct their own narratives. Overall, these lines of thought have sought to make visible the worldviews and epistemic frames of traditional peoples, vulnerable populations, socially stigmatized groups, lay expertise, and also peripheral science, valuing their role to face the present planetary crisis. They propose to promote what they consider to be cognitive justice, paradigm order, and border thinking, among other terms. The Indian scholar Homi Bhabha mobilizes the idea of knowledge hybridization, which implies that other and denied knowledge infiltrates the dominant discourse and destabilizes the basis of its authority and rules. The Belgian philosopher of science Isabel Stengers talked about a cosmopolitics as a way to promote and respect an ecology of practices as a basis to epistemic pluralism. All those propositions may open up new ways to resituate science as a creative and open endeavor. My third point proposes to establish a dialogue between this debate and the issues raised by the open science movements. Almost 20 years after the Budapest Declaration, the open science debate poses new agendas and issues for scientific production and communication. Scientific journals, in particular, are challenged to renew their practices, criteria, and formats, considering aspects such as access to data, open peer review, alternative metrics, adoption of more friendly formats to content and metadata retrieval, attribution of co-authorship and acknowledgement of the contribution of citizen scientists, open infrastructures, among other points. Thus, we understand open science as a movement of movements, a process under construction that mobilizes different and sometimes conflicting interests and points of view. In this sense, similarly to other social change processes, open science and open access have been affected and redirected by reaction and counter-reaction forces. On the one hand, there are the pressures and demand for expanding speed and the means of collaboration in research by opening its results. On the other hand, powerful economic agents, commercial publishers in particular, reposition themselves in this new scenario. They have developed new business strategies in order to maintain or even extend their profit rates, as well as their protagonism in decision-making systems that affect the circulation of science and thus the conditions of scientific production. I will not go into detail here because I believe this topic will be further addressed in the panel, but suffice it to say that those new business models, especially open access by charging authors, have had uneven repercussions contributing to increase the asymmetries between the scientific systems of the different countries. It should be noted that over the past 20 years, while European countries and the United States, the global north, have maintained a system of scientific publications combining commercial and non-commercial publishers, in Latin America, most scientific journals have been public funded, keeping open access free of charge to authors and readers. In Latin American countries, therefore, the main risk is that the APC, the article processing charge model, prevails and that open access policies migrate to a centrally commercial model. It is argued that while in the advanced economy, the interest is to maintain research conditions by expanding open access publications, even in the commercial or hybrid model, in southern countries, the main challenge is to expand research conditions while maintaining open access publications free of charge and with autonomy in its governance. Another emerging business model in scientific publishing has been the provision of paid services by commercial publishers or companies associated with them in verticalized structures for the development of tools and platforms of data extraction and analysis as part of an emerging data or platform economy. Scientific journals, that is, their authors and readers, have increasingly produced data used to support monitoring and evaluation processes that subsidize research reward and funding mechanisms. In addition to the economic dependence caused by this business model, there is also a risk of increasing subordination of academic communities, especially in peripheral economies, to evaluation criteria and methodologies guided by external and even algorithmic parameters, often far from their interests and realities. To a large extent, the so-called internationalization-based quality criteria determine these parameters and feed into this business. Quoting again, Cameron Nilo here present, he criticizes what he calls the dominance of the performance of excellence rather than excellent performance. He has been already quoted, but he says that our systems of research evaluation systematically privilege what is seen as international, which is really code for North Atlantic. Such journals claim to deal with topics of global interest, but in fact deal preferentially with those that are North Atlantic. This equation of international with a narrow geographic area is a natural consequence of structural power and historical contingency. So, on the other hand, the so-called Global South does not want kind of open science or open access that transform them into mere data producers as raw material for what is called an advanced science, nor into mere consumers of paid products and services derived from value-added data. At the same time, the debate on open science expands or rather transcends the so-called scientific field as formulated by the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. It has been noticed that open science does not concern only the potential and facility for generating and circulating information and knowledge within scientific communities in a new form of scientific productivism. It also implies the overthrowing of hierarchies of established sources of authority and reputation. Resuming the discussion of the previous item of this presentation, open science supposes the greater porosity of science and its dialogue with other types of knowledge, considering the broad spectrum of actors and spaces for producing knowledge and formulating different questions. In this sense, the traditional notions of popularization of science give way to the idea of knowledge co-production, advocating for more horizontal relations between distinct epistemic bases, valuing the fertility of their mutual affections. Citizen science itself is urged to move towards an extreme citizen science. Therefore, the very idea of openness is under dispute. One must question opening for whom and under what conditions. What is at stake is not merely the quantitative dimension of openness to focus on access, but its qualitative aspect, the kind of knowledge we want to produce. This has clear reflections on the geopolitics of knowledge and on the kind of globalization we should pursue. My fourth and last point takes up the initial question about which inclusive globalization we are referring to. Here, I will reinforce the thesis of a common science or a science of the commons. Going back to my first point, the current global crisis, the roles of a global thought, and the clash between a globalization plus perspective and a globalization minus one, we must face the fact that there is no consensus about what the planet should be, nor about the meaning of living and being together. Life, the right to existence, and the possibility of a variety of modes of existence constitute the very body of an ecology of knowledges as a source of creativity and as a condition for designing future alternatives. An ecology of knowledges corresponds in its turn to an ecology of powers. As much as deforestation and forest fires annihilate the biodiversity stocks, the historical and ongoing war against indigenous and traditional communities, but also against migrants, social minorities, Black and poor people, also annihilate social and knowledge diversity. Both are requirements for facing the current planetary crisis. This is not only an academic debate. It has significant repercussions both in the field of politics and of policies. Development policies and knowledge policies are increasingly intertwined. On the other hand, there is no single solution and policy prescription. Instead, there are a myriad of alternatives that could take different forms for different societies in different places and times. This is a crucial issue if you want to promote the great conversation in science. Such conversation indicates going beyond an ethics of coexistence between different epistemological matrices towards a perspective of polyphony, of communication in its original etymological sense of becoming common. In this sense, the Spanish researcher Antonio Lafuente proposes the term common science. For him, common implies not only the sense of common goods, the commons. Common is above all a relational concept. It mainly refers to the in-between, the relationship with diversity with the other. Common might also mean the ordinary, that which is not sacred or hierarchically superior, different again from the idea of commons which contains the symbolism of the sacred, of earth, water, and knowledge itself. For Lafuente, quoting him, the goods we want to protect are not knowledge itself, but the plurality of forms of socialization it promotes. The commons would then be a historically differentiated way of producing knowledge, community, and commitment. This supposes to broaden and deepen our theoretical and conceptual frameworks in order to further develop a point of view based on the perspectives, characteristics, and potentialities of different social territorial contexts. Our task should be to create open spaces and open infrastructures in which the diversity of lines of thought and ways of being can speak and can be heard, recognizing and considering the different actors and visions, not only the dominant or institutionalized ones, but also the peripheral, the emerging ones. Science needs this criticism. Above all, the science that dictates standards, parameters, and protocols, and which dominates infrastructures worldwide. Making explicit these existing tensions, conflicts, and differences can be a road to the construction of a common world and a common future. Thank you very much.